So I'm going to talk to you guys about the Unified Stream Assessment and what it is and why they are going to use it today. So one of the first steps in the Urban Subwatershed Restoration Manual by the Center for Watershed Protection is to calculate the impervious cover of a watershed. So I figured that should be my first step as well. I mapped out impervious cover data for the Lower Weber. The higher the percentage of impervious cover, the lower the expected stream quality is. And if you recall back to this morning, Carol mentioned that a 60% impervious cover is sort of that threshold where streams are really just conveyance channels, and restoration projects feel a lot more difficult and expensive. So there are many stream protocols assessment out there, so why are we suggesting the USA? Well, it has been extensively tested and is really the product of many different stream assessment protocols kind of rolled into one. It allows you to evaluate stream conditions and identify potential restoration opportunities. It works well in small watersheds like you have here in the Lower Weber. It takes up relatively little time for all the data you're able to get out of it, and it's inexpensive and doesn't require much training. There's also a sister assessment to the Unified Stream Assessment called the USSR, or Unified Subwatershed and Site Reconnaissance. This one is used outside of the stream corridor in more upland areas to look at pollution sources and restoration potential there. And together they kind of give you a full picture of your watershed, your sub-watershed. But due to time constraints, we'll only be talking about the USA. So there are 9 components to the USA. 8 of those are impact assessments, and then there's 1 reach assessment. The impacts are looking out for stormwater outfalls, severe erosion, impacted vegetative buffers, trash, stream crossings, channel modification, and miscellaneous for anything else you may find. And I'll show you examples of those in a second. So to actually use the USA, you travel up a given stream reach and fill out an impact assessment whenever you see one. And then you fill out that reach assessment at the end. So you'll end up with many impact assessments and 1 reach assessment. You'll walk upstream, like I mentioned, but there are cases where you need to identify which bank an impact occurs on, and that is done facing downstream. So if you imagine you are the stream traveling down your little corridor, it'll be on your left and right. Another pro tip is to make sure you have plenty of data sheets, because you never know how many of those impacts you're going to run into. And you can probably presume that you'll need extra outfall, stream crossing, and channel modification sheets, because those are common in urban streams. So for the sheet itself, every sheet, including the reach assessment, is laid out in the same way to make them easy to use. The top section is the identification section where you write in your location, date, time, etc. The second section is used to describe the impact itself. So on this outfall sheet, is asking about the condition of the pipe and the water coming out of it. And on the channel modification sheet, it's asking for more details about the type of modification. The bottom section is where you determine if the impact has potential for restoration, and they'll sort of guide you through this section to leading questions. And then there's space right at the bottom for a sketch or for extra notes. This is the reach assessment. You can see it's a bit longer, but it's still organized in the same way. So the top is the information section. The middle is the condition section. And the second page is a condition assessment that will have you rank the reach in a way similar to how you rank the impacts. So you can add up your scores from this section and get a score for the overall condition of the reach. The reaches are intended to be compared to one another, but you can use the score to put the reach in a category of optimal, suboptimal, marginal, or poor. So the first impact to look out for is going to be outfalls, which includes any type of pipe that is dumping water into your tree. We'll take note of the condition of the pipe, what it's made out of, and the quality of the water coming out of it. Potential restoration efforts for an outfall would include daylighting, which is allowing the creek to move above ground rather than through pipe, stabilization around the outfalls if there's a lot of erosion, or installing a stormwater retrofit. If the water coming out of the outfall has water quality issues, there's also the chance to investigate the discharge and find the source. Severe erosion is kind of self-explanatory. It's pretty obvious when there is bare patches of earth troughing off and exposed tree roots. that you've got some erosion issues. So to prevent you from constantly filling out erosion sheets in particularly bad areas, they recommend only recording banks that are noticeably worse than average or are impacting infrastructure. The general state of erosion can be recorded on reach assessments. Usually, stream restoration for erosion means bank stabilization, and soft practices are what's recommended versus hard practices like rock. So an example of a soft practice would be using coconut fiber or other biodegradable fiber to temporarily hold the bank in place while live root planing stabilize the bank as they grow. The buffer is the area directly around the stream corridor. Utah doesn't have a set guideline for buffer width as of now, but if we go off of the Riparian Ordinance Toolkit, we should have at least 50 feet between the stream and any infrastructure. It's also possible for the buffer to be considered impacted if it's wide enough, but it's overrun with invasive species. You only need to record impacted buffers longer than 100 feet, just like erosion, because that can be picked up in the reach assessment as well. The form will ask you dominant land cover inside the buffer and then the type of land outside the buffer. And restoration for this impact would be plantings or bufferscaping. For the utilities impact assessment, we're looking for manhole covers or exposed pipe in the channel. This only applies to pipes that are completely enclosed or should be, not the pipes that purposely empty into a stream. So you'll look at the condition of the utility and where it's located within the stream, and then you'll also look for any evidence of discharge. Another important thing to note for this one is that major power lines are also counted as a utility in a corridor, especially if they are impacting your stream buffer. Restoration opportunities for utilities include structural repairs, citizen hotlines, fish barrier removal, if that's applicable. We only found one instance of trash for both of the sections of Case Creek Blue Locks, and good job, Leighton. You only need to know large collections of trash and not every single bottle or can that you see. You will know the type of trash, like commercial or residential, and then its probable source. Restoration for this impact will be a stream cleanup event or a stream adoption. And on the assessment sheet, it will ask who could handle the cleanup and how many pickup loads it would take to remove everything. Stream crossings are a common place for downstream scour holes and upstream sediment deposition, which can threaten adjacent embankments and undermine roadways. But we are also looking at natural stream crossings, such as dams or even waterfalls if they create a change in grade. The assessment sheet will ask you to describe the type and general features of the crossing. And if it's a culvert, there's a little bit more information that you fill out. Potential restoration practices at a stream crossing include fish barrier removal. As a reminder, a fish barrier is a drop greater than 6 inches. And then culvert repair or an upstream storage retrofit. The next impact is channel modification. On this sheet, we'll be selecting from 4 different channel modification options, which are channelization or straightening, armoring such as riprap or gabions, and if it's a fully concrete channel, and floodplain encroachment from activities like fill placement. The picture on the left is an example of bank armoring, and on the right is an example of channel straightening. And since that picture on the right isn't super long, I wanted to give you more context from where that's coming from. So the red pin is where the photo was taken. The creek is running east to west, and then you can see it takes kind of a left turn, which is evidence of the stream channel being altered because the creek will never naturally flow like that. And then it continues on in a straight line out towards Salt Lake. Our last impact assessment form is a miscellaneous form, which covers anything else you may come across. We happen to find examples of construction and of a potential water quality issue from these mysterious suds. Other examples of miscellaneous impacts are high quality habitat and stream gauges. The only thing you need for this form is to write what it is and if there's any possibility for restoration. That's it. Our last assessment sheet is the reach assessment. This is potentially the most important sheet because it will give you an overview of the physical characteristics and the restoration potential of the reach, which will then make it easy to determine which reaches are best to focus efforts in. So now I thought it might be a good idea to practice filling out an assessment. an impact assessment and a reach assessment. It'll be a little difficult, so we have pictures to go off of, but hopefully it'll help everything come together when we're out on our field trip. I decided to go through an outfall sheet because I figured this is probably one that we'll see often. So we'll be using this outfall on the right for reference. The top of the form is the information section. So we're going to fill in what sub-watershed we are in, which is Case Creek. Fill in the date, who you are. We called this Reach West Beaver Lane. We came across this outfall at 10:16 a.m. I'm calling the photo CO1 because Pristine took it on her phone and it was the first photo of the day. The site will be OT1, says the first outfall of the day. And Latin long you can get off your phone or the photo you take later on. And I would recommend changing this to decimal degrees like I did instead of lat long. LMK is not necessary anymore, so you can leave that in the GPS unit blank. For the assessment portion, the creek is flowing from right to left in this photo, so the outfall is on creek right. This is a closed pipe, so we only need the top half of this dotted box. The outfall is made out of concrete, it's circular, it's singular, and we didn't get in and measure it, but I'm estimating it's about 3 inches. It's not submerged. It does have a moderate flow coming out of it. Moving down, we'll note the condition of the outfall, which I think is in pretty good shape. Odor, you'll have to take my word on, but we didn't notice anything while we were out there. You can see a flow line kind of on the inside of that pipe there. It is a little hard to see, but I wrote that down. There's no other deposits or stains. The density of the vegetation around the outfall looks pretty normal, so we probably aren't leaking any nutrients. And likewise, there's no growth of any plants inside the pipe either. There's no pool because the water is running straight onto that rock. The next part only needs to be filled out if the outfall is flowing, which obviously this one is. The water looks clear. It's not cloudy. There's no floatables such as oil or trash. I had a few other concerns. The first one is bank erosion. You can see the water is worn down a path, like from the pipe to the rocks, probably a 6 to 8 inch drop. And the rock is definitely putting in some work here to stop a scour pond from forming. And you can see the sediment that was probably between the pipe and the rock down in the water. I was going to split, but I forgot. But it's right under that rock. You can see a pile of sediment forming. So for my other concern, and for the restoration section, I wanted to give the outfall a little bit more context. So here it is. You can see there's a road and a residential area nearby off to the left of the photo. And then you can also see these suds in the creek. Suds can be completely natural, but this amount seemed a little bit high, and the fact that we found that pile of suds upstream leads me to believe that this could be human caused. So I'm going to write suds coming from upstream in the other section. And while it's obvious the suds aren't coming from this outfall, I still noted it and wrote a checked discharge investigation because it could be good to know how far the suds are traveling downstream. Continuing on in this restoration box, the stream can't be daylighted because of the road and the homes, so there's no other restoration potential at this time. It could need bank stabilization in the future since it is actively loading. But it's not an immediate threat. As for the overall severity section at the bottom, I gave it a 3. So I thought it fit solidly in the middle column where discharge is small. Flow is clear and odorless. It isn't adding much to the base flow of the stream, and any impact it may have is localized. I would make a sketch at the bottom here, and then I'd be done with this assessment form. So pretty easy and quick. Now for the reach assessment, we'll be using Layton Commons Park as an example. I'm not going to fill out the top section again because it's pretty self-explanatory. So we'll jump down to the next section where we describe the recent weather and land use. When we went, it had not rained in the past 24 hours and it was overcast. The area is obviously mostly a park, but there was a residential area on one side at the downstream end. Next is the average condition of the reach. The first thing to look for is base flow as percent of channel width. So here's our creek. You can see the bottom is almost completely, if not completely, covered in water. There are a few spots where the stream didn't entirely cover the bottom, but this is a pretty good representation of average. So I'm going to say that the base flow made up 75 to 100% of the channel width. Next is dominant substrate. This one was a little hard because a lot of the creek looked like this, but there were other sections with larger rocks. But I decided that overall this was the best representation of the reach. So I would consider that substrate to be gravel, 0.1 to 2.5 inch rock. This also happens to be a good photo for water quality. You can see the water is pretty clear, there are no suspended sediments, and it's not opaque. So we'll put clear for water quality. I don't have any photos of aquatic plants in the stream because I didn't see any. So we'll put no for both of those. And then for wildlife, I'll put ducks. There are a lot of ducks at Lake Collins Park.
We actually call it the Lake Duck Park.
Do you? Checks out. I consider the reach stream mostly shaded, as you can see from the photo on the right. For the next section, for channel characteristics, I put all the photos together on the next slide. But I noticed dam cutting, widening, sediment deposition, bank scour, and that it's channelized. So here are the photos of those processes. You can see on the left here, both banks are quite a bit higher than the water. It's probably not easily going to reach that floodplain unless there's a major flood event. So that's indicating down cutting by the creek. You can also see the creek's right side grassy bank is overhanging, which indicates some scouring going on underneath. The top center photo is it's a photo of large amounts of sediment that were being dredged out from behind the dam. The small head gate at the side can't let out much water at a time, so it's the perfect spot for the water to slow down and drop all the sediment that it had been carrying. At the bottom here, we have some evidence of widening. You can see the creek is narrower on the right of the photo than it is on the left. And it's also been channelized, as shown on the right-hand side photo. The stream comes downstream in a straight line and then makes a 45-degree bend. So, as I mentioned earlier, that just isn't something a creek is going to do without human intervention. The next thing we're looking at is channel dimensions. So I think the left and right bank were both about 2 feet high. Or tall, I guess. The stream is an average of 4 feet wide across the bed and 7 feet wide bank to bank. Oops. For reach accessibility at the bottom, I put a 5. Why? Oh, my 5's already up there. Because it's a park with public ownership, at least city owned, it's easily accessible. There's room to stockpile materials and there's easy access for heavy equipment. The last part of the reach assessment is the overall stream condition. So we'll decide on optimal, suboptimal, marginal, or poor for each criteria. For in-stream habitat, I felt that habitat was at the higher end of marginal because there weren't any logs or branches in the creek. Substrate is frequently disturbed, judging by the amount that pile up behind that dam. For vegetative protection, I felt that it was missing the shrub class, but it was mostly old trees with grass. The banks weren't all that bare, and it wasn't heavily grazed, so I gave that a suboptimal rating. For bank erosion, it wasn't eroding at a super fast pace. There's no immediate threat to infrastructure, so I put that at the high end of marginal. And for floodplain connection, the stream was generally able to reach the floodplain during pretty high flows, but not really at any other time, so I put that at the lower end of suboptimal. The bottom half of the page is the overall buffer and floodplain condition. So for the vegetated buffer width, this reach was in a park, and housing was only close to one side of the creek on the downstream end. So the buffer still wasn't bigger than 50 feet, so I ranked that as suboptimal. Floodplain vegetation was pretty good. So it was a majority mature forest, so that made it into the optimal category. Floodplain habitat was not the best. There were no wetlands, definitely evidence of ponded water. So I put that at the lower end of marginal. In the floodplain encroachment category, I thought this fit into the higher end of marginal. Some of that encroachment is from land development, and some of that was the trail being close to the creek and turf grass on the other side, which isn't terrible, but not ideal, because there's not much biodiversity there. So if we add up our stream condition score of 45 and our floodplain score of 46, we get 91 out of 160 points. So that means that the latent commons park breach of Case Creek is suboptimal, which doesn't sound great, but it is the second best category. So you've walked your reaches and filled out your assessments. Now what? Now is the time to compile the data. So here's a table with some examples and metrics that you can get from each type of assessment. Pause for reading or something. Okay. So once we compile all of our data, we can plan some restoration activities. You can make a map of your stream reaches and easily see which are the best targets for restoration due to current condition, accessibility, etc. This table summarizes the potential restoration practices I've been listing throughout the presentation, and for each impact and for the reach. So with that, I will take any questions you might have, and then we can head out.